about what is happening in the region. We value his presence at our meetings always, and we hope he will give a longer report than the maybe 10 minutes he will do now for the event. So please, Dr. Francisco.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation again. Things are moving in the right direction in Latin America now. I'll put it like this. I think we're winning, even though it's tough. It's quite difficult because US imperialism, which is having tremendous crisis, is fighting back and doing damage as much as it can, but we're still defeating them, even though there is damage in the process. In the case, for example, of Peru, where the masses elected a left-wing government, a primary school teacher to be the president from an indigenous background, which is really interesting, in an election that was very hotly contested, that was pretty tight in terms of numbers, in terms of electoral performance. Nevertheless, in the very few days, I think it's about 3 weeks that the government has been in place, it took more than 43 days for the government to be recognized by the institutions and authorities in Peru. In the few days the government has been in place, as number one, abandoned the US-created Lima Group that was designed to overthrow the government of Venezuela and create all conditions to facilitate the possibility of a military or external intervention against Venezuela, against the Bolivarians there. So Peru now is left. So the Lima Group doesn't have Lima to meet in, so they have to find somebody somewhere else, which is quite a big blow. And the second thing that they did was that the government of Peru recognized the Venezuelan government, which the previous government did not recognize because they recognized Juan Guaido. So that's another shift in the right direction. Nevertheless, the foreign minister who was able to introduce these changes has been forced to resign by the huge pressure of the military, the media, and the general right wing, plus the support of US imperialism and imperialism in general. My sense is that the Peruvian government decided not to go for a confrontation on this one, and therefore the foreign minister, who's an excellent guy, a luxury, I think, in my view, was forced to resign and they appointed somebody else. So it's going to be necessary to build some solidarity with Peru as soon as possible. Thankfully, in the UK as well as elsewhere, we have already all the organizations, bodies, mobilizations, social forces, political coalitions, and so on ready, but we need to put it together. That's number one. Number two, which is another important development, is that Mexico, the president of Mexico, the president of Argentina, and the president of Bolivia are working together to ensure that the General Secretary of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, is indicted for having perpetrated, which can only be considered a crime against humanity, and intervening in the internal affairs of Bolivia by facilitating the conditions that led to the coup d'etat, the overthrow of the government in 2019, allowing a de facto government that lasted 11 months, that caused havoc, perpetrated massacres, persecuted people, and so on. And now Luis Almagro, who was the key legitimating institution for that coup, now he's being very heavily pressurized by these three governments. My understanding is that three governments are going to do two things. Number one, present the charges against Luis Almagro to the international court. Not necessarily, there are a few international courts, but I think the one where that will be receptive. And he's in trouble. And the foreign minister of Mexico, instructed by the president, has already announced that they're going to get rid of the Organization of American States. They're going to replace it with something else, which is likely to be the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean states, which is what they had already. So this is a huge step forward. The Organization of American States, the OAS, has been the instrument of the United States to organize, to legitimate absolutely every intervention in the region. So this is excellent. Remember, it was the Organization of American States that expelled Cuba back in 1962 because Cuba decided to give itself a Marxist government. And in the statutes of the Organization of American States, this is not a crime. There is no norm that says that you cannot decide what kind of political government you're going to have. Nevertheless, Cuba was expelled. So this is another very important step forward. And the third one, there is plenty more, but I concentrate on these three only because of time. The third one is there will be elections in Venezuela on the 21st of November. What is new about this is the very fact that the extreme right wing of Venezuela has decided to participate, one, in the dialogue that's been sponsored by Mexico, and these conversations have been taking place in Mexico, and they have decided to participate also in the elections. And the real decision-making there that led them to take this position is the US government. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So what you have really in this dialogue that is taking place between the Venezuelan government and the various right-wing oppositions, because they're very divided, is essentially a conversation between the US government, between the Venezuelan government and the US government. And there is already some hints that are coming through the US political establishment that they might start lifting some of the sanctions against Venezuela. Come the election in November the 21st, every indication signals that the Chavistas are going to win pretty nicely. This is very good because it's democracy, it's discussion, is dialogue rather than the pressure from the United States to organize some sort of external, obviously military intervention organized by them, which was the previous position. Biden seems to be changing that. I don't have any trust in Biden at all, but I think the pressure of circumstances forced him to do this. So this is going to be an excellent development because once that is the case, once that the elections take place, there is not going to be any reason whatsoever for the United States not to recognize the result of the election. The European Union already has a mission, an electoral mission in Venezuela already. They're going to observe the elections and so on. And the European Union took the decision some months ago to de-recognize Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. In fact, nobody recognizes Guaido anymore, apparently, apart from Colombia, apart from Brazil, Bolsonaro, and almost nobody else. So in that sense, it seems to me that the region is moving towards a very new situation. And there are going to be elections in Nicaragua as well. I don't have the time to go into that, where the FZLN, the Sandinistas, are going to win very clearly. So come next year, and I'll finish with this. Come next year in 2022, we're going to have excellent conditions for the most important, in my view, jewel in the ground, or icing in the cake, which is the elections in Brazil. If Lula, which is a candidate, wins, which is very likely against Bolsonaro, then obviously the region is going to shift quite dramatically because the weight, economic and political weight of Brazil, quite dramatically on our side. And after that, I think we're going to go on the offensive, judging by the calamitous state of US imperialism, showing by the debacle in Afghanistan. I think we have a very good chance to come back to the pink tide that was doing very good things not recently, not very long ago. So I'm very optimistic and very hopeful, but we have to put our contribution towards it. They're going to need all the solidarity that we can muster. So I'll be calling back on to all of you, as well as other people, to help us out, to give solidarity to these people, because there is plenty more to do, such as the situation in Haiti, the situation in Colombia, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Francisco. I'll allow a few questions because there were so many issues raised there instead of leaving it for much later. So if you have a question, if you raise your hand, I think, Steve, you can organize a bit. But there's a question I wanted to put to you, Francisco, which is around the de-recognizing Guaido. And I know that the British recently continue in the law courts to try to hold on to the gold of Venezuela. And I think the latest decision I'd seen was like, it's still, they're still preferring Guaido. So has there been any change in the British government position in terms of the $1.5 billion in gold that they hold for Venezuela, which amongst a massive barefaced theft? So any changes there?
No, the UK government is the most recalcitrant one of them all, but they are, from the legal point of view, because the case of the gold has gone through the courts already 3 times. And the first one was won by Guaido. The second one was won by the Venezuelan government. And the third one is they left it, they kick it into long grass, as it were. And the UK government is holding on to the old position by the filth of their fingernails. Legally, this cannot stand. My understanding is, I don't have privy information, but my understanding is the Venezuelan government is waiting its time to make sure that it intensifies the pressure, because the pressure is not only for the 31 tons of gold to be returned to Venezuela, but also there is about $7 billion which is being illegally retained by financial organizations in Europe, plus several companies in the United States that have been illegally confiscated by the Trump government are being disputed, I understand secretly or sort of discreetly, by the Venezuelan government. From their statements, I gauge that they seem to be winning, because legally you cannot sustain. And the reason why I want to justify this last point that I made very briefly, which is this: if you behave in the way they are behaving, or they have behaved with Venezuela by retaining illegally these resources, then the problem is this: they may get away with it, but in terms of the size of the amounts of money being returned, is not much, especially given that there is plenty of years in the future for economic development, investment, and so on. And the position of the dollar is extremely weak. So if the behavior is the way Trump did it, then many countries around the world are going to start pulling out their reserves from US banks and from European banks. And the consequence of this is going to be a massive weakening of the dollar, more than it is already. So from their point of view, it may mean that they maintain some few gains in terms of retaining these resources, but in the medium term, they're going to lose big time, especially now that the geopolitics in the world is being reorganized so intensely, with China emerging as a big power. And therefore, if the United States is going to retain any position, then they need to actually, how can I put it? They need to save face by allowing the government of Venezuela to recover all its resources. And what we're talking about is something in the region of between $45 to $60 billion, which the Venezuelans will recover. So this is pretty big game. And I think the Venezuelans are playing it absolutely right. No big fuss, slowly, keep the pressure up, mobilize all the institutions that can, particularly the United Nations, but many others, and it looks good.
Yeah, well, CLS will be with you. Steve, has there been any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't know if any hands are raised.
Shall we move on to Gus?
Yes, okay, there's no hands raised. Okay, well, our next speaker doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I know him for a very long time, and as a matter of fact, from the time of the events in New Cross, that was my first contact with Gus. I was actually working in a factory nearby in New Cross at the time of that fire that claimed so many of our young lives. And the writing on the wall in the toilet is something that's always stayed with me. Somebody wrote in the toilet, 1 pint of petrol, 13 niggas, he, a laugh. And that was what was going on in that region at the time. I, of course, joined the demonstrations and the other things that have been happening. And since then, I've known the amount of activities that Brother Gus has been involved in. Even today on the radio, some of you would have seen him in the documentaries recently, and also in the film by the recent film Small Axe by Steve McQueen. But that's not only that, he's not only a spokesman, but he's a real genuine activist. He does the work on the ground. It's not about just being on a platform. He's committed to actually doing real work. And this is what makes him different from many activists, academics to me. He actually puts in the time and the work. So without much ado, I will ask Gus to take the floor. I'm sure you'll give him a warm welcome. So welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Luke, for those very generous comments. Colleagues, I don't have a lot of time and there's much I want to share with you. So what I want to do is to canter through some slides and hopefully leave some space so that we can have some discussion, some exchange before we have to move on. What I want to do is really simple, which is to try and make some comments on the state we're in. The state we're in as a people, the condition of being Black in British society in this moment, and the nation state that we're in and what it is dumping upon us. So I've chosen to call this presentation Living with the Hostile Environment When Collective Silence Equals Complicity. And the reason for that, I'm sure, would become evident as we proceed. Next one, please. I want to begin with this quotation, well, two quotations separated by about 100 years, but each reinforces the other, really. This one by Malcolm X. Anytime you live in a society supposedly based upon law and it doesn't enforce its own laws because of the color of a man's skin, happens to be wrong, then I say those people are justified to resort to any means necessary to bring about justice when the government can't give them justice. And following that immediately, that guru of mine, someone whose writings and whose life I consider a constant inspiration, Frederick Douglass, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. I want you to keep that particularly in your consciousness as I go through the next set of slides. So my first comment is this, really. I have always found it ironic that racism and xenophobia runs in the DNA of the British nation, a nation who went around the world without so much as a by your leave, employing genocide, massacres, rape, and to absolve it all, the omnipresent Bible, and particularly Christianity from the major religions in the UK. And talking about massacres and rape, etc., I think it's important that we remind ourselves that all empires sustain themselves and expand through barbarism, whatever empire it is, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, whatever. And the British Empire was no exception to that. Now, that's not just a throwaway point. The point I'm wanting to make through that is to suggest that that barbarism and all its consequences for those who suffered it, it doesn't simply go away. It remains in people's DNA for generations afterwards. And we must take that into account when we consider our present condition and the way in which that barbarism diminished us as a people and diminished the countries and the people to which we belonged before we were enslaved. Imperialism and colonialism served to define this nation and its people's view of themselves and the place in the world. It was the crucible, therefore, in which racism was constructed. Next. So, in the light of all of that, my thesis is that if Britain wished to project itself as a modern post-imperial nation, even if none of its former colonial subjects came here, it needed to confront the legacy of empire and deconstruct whiteness, especially through schooling and education as part of the social structure. It needed to own up to the barbarism it had imposed upon the majority in its own population, as defined by class, by gender, by ethnic nationality, while at the same time manipulating them to focus upon what made them superior to people like us with black and brown skin. But the country continues to promote the belief in whiteness as normative, invincible, and as bestowing the right to belong to the in-group of humanity and to be superior to all other humanoids. And that's basically been at the very core, the essence of British imperialism and colonialism. And of course, we know the consequences of that. If you're white, you're all right. If you're black, stay back. Consequently, we live in a society which validates white people automatically while requiring black people to prove ourselves before we could be thought competent, accepted, capable of fitting in, and worthy to be included. And if we understand what that means, we then understand why the whole notion of black and ethnic minority remains so toxic. In my view, all of that imperial and colonial past required Britain to embrace a particular imperative. And that was to promulgate, to deliver education for liberation. If it was going to save itself, if it was going to not repeat the iniquities of the past, it needed to embrace that concept and operationalize it, expunging racism from the DNA of the nation, righting racial wrongs, first of all, acknowledging before you can right racial wrongs, cultivating a non-racial mindset in its own population, and building a culture of equity that took account of both race and class. Next one. My guru, Paulo Freire, that educationalist who is perhaps the most important such person that we've had in the globe, had this to say: education does not change society. Education changes people. People change society. So what you do with education and how you position it to change people then becomes very important, which is why we must have a concern about what goes on in schooling and education around this country now and for the last 70 plus years. Now, this is an important quote from C.L.R. James. And if you haven't read that book, The Future and the Present, you really should. He's talking about Leonard Lyle, writing in a chapter entitled British Barbarism in Jamaica, Support the Negro Workers' Struggle. And Lyle had this to say: I cannot believe that I was unsound in stating that the West Indian laborer does not remotely resemble the English laborer. And this is what James says in retort. Tate and Lyle make a fortune every year by selling to the British workers sugar grown by Jamaican workers. They must keep these two, Jamaican workers and British workers, divided at all costs. Hence, with that shamelessness so characteristic of British capitalism, Lyle discovers that the West Indies laborer does not remotely resemble the English laborer. Next one, please. The real trouble is, of course, that he resembles the English laborer too much for Mr. Capitalist Lyle. In this article, first published in 1938, James is calling on the British workers in their unions, the organized labor movement, to press for full democratic rights for the West Indian workers. He says, Tate and Lyle are planning to open factories in Jamaica. They want to take advantage of labor which has not the right to as yet to protect itself. Thus, black is used against white, and Leonard Lyle seeks to poison the mind of the British worker against the West Indian worker. And again, if you have not read this book, available from New Beacon Books in Stroud Green Road, 76 Stroud Green Road in Finsbury Park, then you should. Because in order for us to understand our positionality as Caribbean people, coming from a reserved pool of labor in the Caribbean after the Second World War, we must understand what Arthur Lewis is writing about in terms of that period from that Great Depression in the middle 1920s to the period leading up to the start of the Second World War in 1939. And this is a quote from Lewis talking about the Caribbean. The white population is relatively small, averaging about 3% of the total. This tiny white element dominates every aspect of West Indian life, 3%. Economically and politically, the white man is supreme. He owns the biggest plantations, stores, and banks, controlling directly and indirectly the entire economic life of the community. A number of factors have contributed to increase the political consciousness of the Caribbean West Indian workers. Foremost, it is the Italian conquest of Abyssinia. West Indians felt that in that issue, the British government betrayed a nation because it was black. And this has tended to destroy the faith in white government and to make them more willing to take the fate in their own hands. And Arthur Lewis, of course, was absolutely right. The British worker, whose experience of the West Indian worker, Whitehall and Mr. Leonard Lyle sought to deny, had established a position of strength through their organized labor movement and was wielding some bargaining power. After two devastating wars in 30 years, 1914 to 18, 1939 to 45, they determined that things were not to be the same anymore. And my thesis is that it is precisely that position of strength which those different workers from the colonies were introduced to undermine. The 1956 visit of London Transport to Barbados to set up a recruitment center through the good offices of the Barbados Immigration Service was not altogether unconnected with the industrial action London Transport had been experiencing at that time. And so it is within that context that we have to locate, situate state racism in Britain and what I call the hegemony of language. 4 generations after that reserved pool of labor started to arrive here, the descendants of those who arrived in 1948 and in the decades that followed are still labeled ethnic minorities and potentially illegal immigrants. And that's an issue I shall return to later in this presentation. So as you will remember, hopefully, the beat the ban hike in the number of migrants arriving in the UK in advance of the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act was as follows. 1959, 21,550. 1960, 58,300, more than double. 1961, again, more than double, 125,400. People being, what's the word, hemorrhaged, if you like, from the Caribbean, a reserved pool of labor that the British had left unsupported, without any industries, without any employment to absorb that labor, but whom they hung on to because we all held passports reading citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies. That is what enabled us to come here legitimately, justifiably, as citizens in the period before and after 1948. But by 1965, the Labour Party, and I'll say lots more about them in a minute, was saying this. One of the worst Home Secretaries of all time, Roy Hattersley, was pronouncing that without integration of us into British life, limitation, in other words, racialized immigration, was not excusable. But without limitation, racialized immigration, integration was impossible. And he states it's not been an easy decision to take. That 1965 immigration legislation, the honorable but mistaken opposition to the 1961 immigration legislation has made it much more difficult, but the cause of integration will be well served. So he is therefore legitimizing, justifying the additional constraints that were put in 1965, building upon 1962, by suggesting that you needed to limit the number of people coming in order to ensure and secure the integration of those who were already here. So the 1965 Race Relations Act made discrimination on the grounds of color, race, ethnic, or national origins illegal in public places, except in Northern Ireland. It was the first legislation in the UK since 1948 or ever to tackle racial discrimination. That was repealed by the 1968 Act, which additionally prohibited discrimination in housing, employment, and the provision of goods and services. Next. But that didn't come from nowhere. The 1968 Act was the direct result of the work of the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, CARD. CARD was an interracial body of activists. It was founded by David Pitt, a Grenadian like myself, a GP unlike myself, who later became Lord Pitt of Hampstead, having failed to win election as a Labour MP. The Labour voters would have none of it. And he was joined by others, including Anthony Lester, QC, Eric Lubbock, Lord Avebury of the Liberal Party, and a number of others. Next. So what did CARD do? CARD went around gathering evidence of how Black people were being discriminated against. And I was one of those taking part in that fact finding. So a white and black a pair would go after the same job or after rented accommodation or whatever. The Black person would be told the position has been filled, the room has gone, and the white person, their counterpart, would apply literally 5, 10, 15 minutes later and be told, yes, you can come, we will interview you this evening, start on Monday, or the room is still available, this is how much it would cost, and you can come and pay your deposit or whatever. So we collected overwhelming evidence of racial discrimination in those respects, including trying to go and book a room in a hotel or to get some services from some other service provider. Next. Next. So, Steve, could you go back one or two? Good. I want to make the point and stress the point that the 1965 Immigration Act positioned Britain on a spectrum. And I'm saying all of this because what I'm trying to do is to paint the backcloth to the hostile environment. That didn't arise immediately, suddenly, without context after 2010. I'm wanting to remind us that it had its origins ever since 1962, and particularly that act in 1965. I am saying that the state positioned itself on the one hand, espousing liberal notions of the value and richness of diversity, ethnic diversity, while passing increasingly racist immigration legislation. And then on the other hand, the far right wanting to keep Britain white, with the political parties oscillating between the center and the far right. In other words, the far right was the extreme end of what the people whom we elected, the conservative government, the Labour government, were themselves doing. And of course, it was on the one hand, the benign form of racist oppression with all these laws and everything apparently working in a consensual way with the consent of the electorate. And on the other hand, these neo-fascists going around nigger hunting, Paki bashing, murdering Black people and people from the Indian subcontinent at will without the state interfering or intervening. So to come to 2016, I am arguing that if you want to understand Brexit and how Farage pushed Cameron and Theresa May to hold a referendum on leaving the EU, you just have to look at the way successive governments since 1962 have racialized immigration by conflating race and immigration and passed draconian laws in every iteration to appease racists and fascists. As you will recall, in 2013, Theresa May, Home Secretary at the time, had vans running around London boroughs with billboards screaming, "Go home or face arrest." In doing so, she cast a veil of suspicion over the entire Black and global majority population of the country, rendering us all of us, potential illegal immigrants, and as such, the targets of anyone, any would-be racist and neo-fascist who felt it was their duty to help the government curb immigration. Because they had form. They've been doing that kind of stuff for decades. The government didn't proscribe the National Front. It didn't proscribe Column 88. It didn't proscribe the British National Party. And they went around murdering people at will and with impunity. So 2016, the Immigration Act, following the 2014 Immigration Act, was passed by royal assent on the 12th of May. It marked the beginning of what came to be known as the Windrush generation being oppressed by the British state in a manner that simply mirrored what they were doing during the days of slavery and the plantation system. The Windrush generation was to experience a loss of liberty, a loss of life as a result of the strictures of that 2016 legislation. By having these vans going around saying, "Go home and face arrest," May was laying the foundations of a hostile environment before she and the parliament even introduced the 2014 and 2016 legislation, which led to the denial of healthcare, loss of employment, and of housing for the so-called Windrush generation. So people who had been here for years, attended the same doctor's surgery for 20, 30, 40 years, were suddenly told, "We can't treat you anymore because we have been informed by the Home Office that you are illegal. And you're not entitled to these services anymore." Let's move on. So, in my book, therefore, those 13 people or more who have lost their lives as a direct result of May's hostile environment and what I call persecution, because I can't think of any other fitting term for it. Persecution by the state, and no less the victims of racist murders than if they had been individually killed by neo-fascists. And I think we need to register this point. Those people, they may have died because they were denied medication for the prostate cancer or the heart disease or the type 2 diabetes or whatever. But in my book, those deaths, avoidable deaths, were no less racist murders than if the National Front or the BNP or Tommy Robinson and his lot had gone and killed people by putting firebombs through the letterboxes. And that is why I call the hostile environment and its casualties and fatalities Theresa May's pogrom. She, no less than Javid, and the even more odious Priti Patel, God knows, has blood on her hands. However much she might think she has washed her hands of all of that messy business and left it to Priti Patel. So 2016, the Immigration Act is passed. bringing in an extension of the UK border force. So nursery, people who run their nurseries, landlords, employers, Uber firms, everybody had a legal duty to make sure that they checked that whoever it was that they were employing was legitimately able to be in this country. All of a sudden, the border force had all of these satellites, all of these other people acting on behalf of the British Immigration Service, constituting an immigration watch, feeding into the nativism that became rampant at that time, a resurgence of racism and xenophobia, which led to the murder of Joe Cox, MP for Batley and Spen in South Yorkshire, and of course, the Brexit referendum. And about the referendum, this is what I say. The Conservative Party under Cameron and May courted UKIP and Nigel Farage and had a shotgun marriage of convenience. UKIP impregnated the Conservative government. Brexit is the offspring, and the likes of Tommy Robinson, the English Defence League, Britain First, and National Action appointed themselves wet nurse. That's the reality that we faced at that time. So, against that backcloth, I am arguing that with or without the scandal of the barbaric treatment of citizens from the Commonwealth who have lived all their lives in this country since 1948, we as African and Asian diaspora in Britain had absolutely no right to take part in any state-sponsored celebration of the Windrush generation's contribution to the richness and diversity of modern Britain, as happened at the Westminster Abbey in June of 1948 to mark 70 years of the Windrush arriving at Tilbury Docks. None whatsoever. And to find all of these Black people in their dandan rushing to Westminster Abbey to be there to hear Theresa May, Prince, whoever it is, representing the Queen, applaud us for coming here in such numbers without any reference to reserve pool of labor, without any reference to how denuded Britain left the Caribbean. All that stupid hype about our adding to diversity and contributing to the building of modern Britain without counting the cost. Complete nonsense. And it takes me back to what Frederick Douglass was saying. Find out what any people would submit themselves to, and you have the exact measure of the oppression that would be heaped upon them. So against that background, what have been the defining experiences of the Windrush generation? Quickly, let's canter through this. And you know it all. I'm just reminding us. Racial discrimination, denial of equal rights and justice, betrayal of our parents' high aspirations for their children, especially of schooling and education as a vehicle for social mobility, stubbornly high levels of school exclusion of Black boys in particular to this day, increasingly high levels of exclusion of primary-age children, and scandalously of children with special educational needs and disabilities. And the government knows it, it gives the statistics, and it wants to do nothing at all about it. Disproportionate number of Black students in pupil referral units and other forms of alternative provision, shunting Black students into schools for the educationally subnormal. And in his introduction, Luke mentioned the Steve McQueen film, brilliant film on that subject. Black boys, Black students, boys in particular, being seen as identified with underachievement in school, and thereby framing the expectations of the low expectations of white teachers. And this pattern now being seen to be replicated even in higher education, with universities being preoccupied with the attainment gap at degree level between Black students and their peers. In 2007, I was asked to address a national conference of vice chancellors. And that's what I had to say to them. The biggest challenge for HE 14 years ago is to ensure that the grading and stratification along ethnic lines that has become so embedded at schooling level is not replicated and structuralized in higher education. So we've graduated from underachievement in school with Black Caribbean boys and Roma children at the bottom to the Black and minority attainment gap at degree level in higher education. In spite of that, people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds have a greater higher education initial participation rate than people of white backgrounds. In other words, we aspire to and go into universities much more than people from white backgrounds. So in addition to all of that, we face the refusal to make the curriculum more relevant to young Black people, and indeed to white young people, and more reflective of our global contribution as African people, as Asian people, to the evolution of knowledge. We experience resistance to decolonizing the curriculum, both in schooling and in further and higher education. And as I keep on saying, you can't hope to decolonize the curriculum without decolonizing the institution itself. And we're all familiar with this, targeting of young people, boys in particular, through criminalization by the police and criminal justice system, stop and search, sus, gratuitous harassment, police activities in schools, gang matrix, profiling, and so on. And that leads inexorably to the overrepresentation of Black males in remand centers, young offender institutions, and adult prisons. Worse than that, worse than all of that, it seems as if Black males in particular have demonstrated year on year for at least the last 30 years an unnatural tendency to die of natural causes while in the custody of the British police. Deaths in custody. This tendency is accentuated when they are suffering from mental illness. And the police think that they are more responsive to the repeated use of police tasers than to treatment from health professionals. Added to that is the disproportionately high unemployment rate among Black school leavers and unemployment and underemployment among Black graduates. We have lived with these unprecedented levels of youth violence. 1 in 3 murders in London involve Black males below the age of 30, either as victims or as perpetrators. And there are more Black people killed by other Black people than by the police and white racists after 70 years of people of my parents' generation coming to this country to provide better opportunities for those same young Black people. So the state has appropriated and canonized Stephen Lawrence. It has crowned his mother, but we fail to ask the question, how many more of the likes of Stephen have we lost at the hands of young people like themselves? And I say this in order to say that, with good reason, we speak truth to power when necessary, and you will know that I do that all the time. But we're much less good at speaking truth to ourselves. For example, if Black Lives Matter, why do they not seem to matter and make us outraged only when they are taken by the state and by white racists and fascists? Is the loss to our community and the additional layers of trauma bereaved families and the community suffer any less if the police or the far right kill our loved ones than if those loved ones are taken by our children themselves? Why have we not tackled the don't snitch policy that enables killers to take Black lives repeatedly while we nurture them as vipers in our very bosoms? Okay, so you might think, oh God, Gus is having a downer today. He's so damn negative. Yes, we've had all of this. We've had Black theater companies, people in film and television, growing number of Olympic Black medalists, Black Premier League footballers being harassed and racialized and abused across Europe. We have Black classical musicians, Black MPs and lords and baronesses, and the numbers increase, except that we can't see in any way, shape, or form what value is it to us, Black police, etc., etc., etc. Let's move on. So we have all of that, including the latest edition, who managed to extricate herself, Meghan Markle, the caramel face of royalty. We've got all of that. And yet we are still referred to and counted as minority ethnic and representative of diversity, rather than being part and essential and integral part of what makes Britain what it is today. As such, we are still eligible to be targeted by those who feel that they are licensed by the hostile environment to treat non-whites as they bloody well please. In that context, let's just remember, we talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion. Inclusion and the idea of having a representative number of Black people in whatever remain very problematic concepts, which many people fail to deconstruct. So quickly running through this again, 2016 Hostile Environment Act passes. Next. And you know all of this stuff. Next one. Next one. So one of the more draconian measures of that act was the removal of those people who were considered to have no right to be here, even if they've lived here for 30 and 40 and 50 years. And the more draconian part of it was that those people needed to be removed before they could appeal, unless they could provide evidence that doing so would cause them serious, irreversible harm or contravene their human rights. So those detainees in that horrendous place, that Alcatraz called Yazwood Immigration Removal Center, have been at the core of the Windrush scandal. Where does that come from? When in 2018, a group of people decided to form this committee to organize the celebration at Westminster Abbey, the chair of that organizing committee said in the bulletin, those who came here on the Windrush in 1948 and after came seeking adventure. It is as if they were bored in Jamaica, bored in Antigua, bored in Grenada, and decided to don their safari suits and get on a boat, Windrush, and come to England seeking adventure. Now, how stupid can you be to make such a statement? Recently, we've had the Wendy Williams report, lessons to be learned from the Windrush scandal. She talked about the Home Office's institutional failings, but said that she could not say categorically that they were institutionally racist, that those who operate immigration laws, 2014, 2016 Immigration Acts, should learn the history of the Windrush generation so that they could be more informed, and that presumably would change the behavior. And she suggested that those operating those laws and enforcing those strictures should act more humanely in the spirit of the Equality and Human Rights Act. I wrote a paper in response to Williams's report, and I called it this: you do not right racial wrongs by doing wrong things more competently. So, to end, and I'm sure Luke would be happy to hear that, that I'm coming to an end. Where do we go from here? We need to consider, against that background, we need to not take the hostile environment as one, if you like, isolated incident in the way in which the British state has responded to us. Yes, it is particular, and for those suffering in the way that I have described, it is the only show in town. We know that. But as I tried to explain from the beginning of this presentation, it has its origins since the 1948 Nationality Act, never mind the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act. So yes, let us concentrate on what is happening to people now as they apply the 2014 and 16 legislation. But let us also remember the bigger picture. What are the implications of globalization, climate change, the relocation of populations for the way in which this nation state is implementing and enacting immigration legislation? What are the implications of all of that for the resurgence of fascism across Europe? What are the implications for us in terms of cross-sectional political organization, especially among the disenfranchised, on the axis at least of race and of class? The urgent need to form alliances and recast representative democracy in Britain and Europe. What should that look like for us after we've been dumped upon, shat upon from a great height by both the Labour government and the Conservative government since we came here in numbers after the Second World War? What are the implications for concentrating power in the hands of the people? How do we do that? And understand that although we accept and welcome the fact that we live in a democracy, that democracy does not deliver our rights evenly, equally, or at all in some cases. How do we take charge of our business and hold the state and its institutions to account? Now, I believe that we have the capacity to demonstrate that we have power and that we are prepared to use it. The classic historical precedent of that is the Black People's Day of Action following the New Cross massacre in 1981, when 20 to 25,000 people took to the streets on an ordinary working Monday to demonstrate to the British state and the British nation that we weren't prepared to sit back and allow those things to happen without making our presence felt, our voice felt, and making demands upon the state in relation to our own safety. So how do we galvanize our atomized power? In practically every part of the state and its employment structures right now, we have staff networks. We've got Black staff networks at universities. We have Black staff networks in the Crown Prosecution Service, the National Black Police Association, Black staff networks in the Civil Service, Home Office, etc., etc. Black members in the trade union movement, the National Education Union, and so on. They all remain atomized. Why can't we galvanize that power and determine that we would show this country that we are not prepared to sit back and let them treat our people in the way that the hostile environment has been treating our elders? Why can't we shut the damn place down now and then in a planned, systematic manner and become visible by making ourselves invisible? If we don't turn up to work on London Transport or on any transport system in the country, if we don't turn up in the National Health Service, if we don't turn up in the civil service, if we don't turn up wherever, on that particular day, we would be invisible. But by our absence, we would make ourselves visible and make these people understand that we are not colluding. We are not, by our silence, being complicit in the oppression of us as a people marginalized in this society. So I'm not talking about a go slow. I'm saying don't go. We don't go to work. We don't go where we're expected to be. And collectively as Black people, if we make our presence not felt, or if we make our absence felt, then the whole nation and its apparatuses would have to sit back and take notice. So, at the very least, even if we're not bold enough to do all of that, let us, for God's sake, get together and demand a repeal of the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts. I'm absolutely sure that I have run over my time.
Yes.
But I came to take you on a journey. I hope I have done that. And I hope you have been able to stay with me at least part of the way. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Gus. That was, I'm sure people will join me in celebrating that talk. Far from wanting to stop you, it was very interesting, very inspiring, and wanting to go on. But you give me a headache. You give me a real headache. You know, we pride ourselves on being an activist organization, but you have outlined so many issues and so many things. We'll be here a lifetime working on them. And that is great. It's good to have things to do. And that you remind us we have power to change things. We want to remind everybody as well that it's only by activism, organizing, that we will make any difference and change things. We will do our bit at Caribbean Labour Solidarity to attach to some of the issues you've flagged up, you've mentioned, and you've done such a broad sweep of issues is only an activist in a lifetime of activism could have touched on so many issues that many of the people I'm sure listening and would be aware of, would have participated in some activity somewhere or the other. And whilst I remember, I thought of the Black People's March, I actually took some pictures on that day, which have never been published and which I pride and keep. And I'd want to encourage people to send to our website any photographs of that eventual day that actually would be a good memory for us, because we should not forget these events, and we need to remember the things and also the other works that we need to do. I like it that you don't mince your words. I mean, the talk was so encouraging and inspiring. You weren't mincing your words there at all. And
let me just interrupt for 1 second.
Yes.
From the time I was young and going to primary school, my mother told me one thing that I have never forgotten. She said, never put your head in a bag to speak.
And you clearly took that on board. But as I said in the introduction, you're not only an academic and get involved with these things, you're an activist. And the card campaign that you mentioned, I never knew were involved in that, but it's the kind of things we need to be doing in terms of selecting an issue, going after it, being organized and doing it. How do we change and tackle all of these issues, getting the wider picture? For me, one of the big issues that CLS has put on our agenda and will always be there is reparations. And we think even with the hostile environment, with the whole Windrush stuff that could only have happened because of the experience of slavery, the brutality of slavery, the way in which those that are in power have internalized those images and those thoughts about Black people, and they can treat us in that kind of fashion that they have done. And I would want to welcome everybody to support and join the reparations for slavery movement anywhere we can, because it's one way of tackling the injustice of racism, raising awareness for people so that we know about what has gone on, especially the way in which the whole fight for decolonizing the curriculum and so on. We need to get the information, not only to our Black youth, but to the white ones as well. They need to understand how deep the racism is in this country and how it will continue to affect our lives unless we tackle it at its root cause. And I'll stop there. I'm sure there's many questions wanting to come forward. I'll depend on Steve and Omar to who gatekeeping and managing things there. I haven't seen any questions on the chat. I haven't had much time to look. If there are any hands going up, now is your time to put your question to Professor Gus John. So please, Steve, can you try and keep some order on whose hands goes up first and when, so we can be fair to our listeners. First question, is there anyone?
There's Anne-Marie Cousins has put her hand up.
Okay, let's can we get her on?
Yes, I'm here. Lovely. Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic and listening to Gus, but I know Gus is a powerful speaker anyway. I did put into the chat that I'm hoping that people have been inspired into action, because I think sometimes what happens is that we listen, we feel good, and then we don't take action. And action is extremely important to make any, sorry, somebody else is on speaking.
Can we remind people to please put your speaker on, mute your speakers so we don't interrupt the general meeting. Thank you. Okay, Anne-Marie, come back.
Thank you for that. I've lost my track. What was I saying? Yeah, that sometimes people listen to speakers, they feel inspired, and then life continues as normal. They don't do anything. So I'm hoping that people will be inspired to make addition. We can all do that in our little corners, wherever we are. And then I did wonder, I suppose this is the key question, why couldn't a day off, don't go to work, be called? You just call the date. It's up to people to do or not do. Certainly the first one, there might not be much take up depending on the publicity and so on around it. But if it became an annual thing, it would grow in the end. I think one of the difficulties sometimes with the African heritage people is that we're so fractionalized with whether we're Caribbean, West Indian, African, or whatever, that we don't focus on the fact that we're African and use that as a central point, perhaps, to coalesce around. Number one, that before you worry about, sometimes for change, it's better to focus on what we have in common rather than what we don't have in common, if that makes sense. So I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. You there? Do you want to respond there, Gus?
Yes, Anne-Marie, good to see you. It's a long time. And
very long.
thanks for those comments and for the question.
You're welcome.
Let me say this. We tend, not unnaturally, to respond to matters episodically. Something happens, it needs an immediate response. We activate and mobilize ourselves, and we respond to that. We're not as good at taking stock of, if you like, structural processes that disadvantage us and that oppress us, and organizing ourselves to do something about those. I think we need both. We need the immediate reaction to particular events, but we also need to be able to focus on understanding what it is in the system that systematically oppresses, marginalizes, and disadvantages us, so that we can have a way of ensuring that we're building a consciousness. I mean, Yvonne Bailey Smith put something in the chat a minute ago about, old codgers like me can talk all this stuff, drawing on experience, but hopefully not too soon. I shall be popping my clogs and pushing up daisies. What then happens? So if I have been doing this stuff since 1964, where are the young people who are gaining that consciousness, to whom I could impart that wisdom and understanding of our defeats and our advances over the last 50, 60 years or whatever, so that they can be better attuned to where they need to be going and the direction they need to be setting for ourselves. Now, I believe that we need some intergenerational conversations, which is why this forum is so important, and others like it, so that we can, it is only when we begin to develop that consciousness and have people debunk some of the stuff that they're being told by the media, by the Labour Party, by the Conservative Party, whatever it is every day, that we develop an independent position and an independent consciousness, such that we have the confidence to go forward and stay at home, to go forward and know that there are many people like us who want to make a difference and who believe in the power of collective action to bring about change.
Yes, we have three people who have put their hands up to speak, which I've lost for a second. Where are we? We have Clover Honey, Paul Phoenix, and Brother Nat. Could I suggest that those three speak together, one after another, and then Gus could reply to them? So could I suggest we go in that order? Clover first.
Excellent.
Yes. Hello. I just wanted to say thank you so much. Not calling you Christopher, brought up that way, but I've actually been so much time to continue. Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, because this, I've been educated in the British school system. I've been educated in the
I'm 53 years old, and what you just shared with me is worth a million days of Saturday school. I am very keen. I'm one of these people who has been an activist, but I've not heard my history knitted together so clearly. So I know what's standing in front of me has a legacy. It's not just 5 years ago with Brexit. It's not just Theresa May and the vans, but this is, you know, my family was drained from the Caribbean. My family in the Caribbean still suffer because of this. And I'm just wondering what it is, what kind of advice you give to, consider myself young people, you know, I want to take on the baton, but how, as a child of the diaspora, how do I have the greatest impact across all of the countries that I come from? So the Caribbean, and how do I support them? Being Black British, as well as I've grew up in Canada and I soon will be moving there. I hope that's not too convoluted question, but I really basically want to know, how do I take the baton, and then how do I can then influence how things are happening in the Caribbean, for example.
Brother Nat?
Oh, did you hear any of that?
Yes, all of it. Thank you. That was great. I was just suggesting that Brother Nat came in next.
Give thanks, Steve. I think there was someone before me, if they did want to go before me, but I'm happy to speak and give thanks. Give thanks, Prof. Gus. Let me actually give thanks, Prof. Gus, for the presentation. Very comprehensive, as always. To my sister that just spoke, if you're not already joining an organization, there's many out there. The Global African Congress, the African People's Revolutionary Party. It's about just joining organizations. I feel, sorry to intrude on just answering if Prof. Gus was going to, but I think it's quite profound when you're in the company of the community you're serving. My question was just quite direct to Prof. Gus and anyone else really, which is, and I pose it a lot. My name is Brother Nat. I'm a representative of the Galaxy Afui radio station, the All Africans People's Revolutionary Party, Global African Congress, like I mentioned. And I do a lot of grassroots and work in the communities and partnering up with those who are part of the conscious community. So we're doing the works. My question was more around, you know, you spoke of taking a day off so that they can take notice. And I did put in a chat, like, on that day off, while we're taking that day off, can we not proceed? And you alluded to it a bit, but in proceeding, just nation building. And what I've learned so far is that there is nation builders and there's freedom fighters. Those that want to interact with the establishment, so we say, and want to contest and say, look what you're doing to us, this is not fair. And also wanting, you know, that reparatory justice. And I get that. But there's those that are just getting on with the building, that are nation building and going about erecting a narrative, a paradigm, a perception, which is purely African centered. And we don't differentiate, like what Previous was saying, differentiate between West Indian or carry us beyond the Americas, those on the continent, Europe. We know that we're all different, but we have those commonalities. So would you advise on putting more energy into trying to freedom fight, as I call it, trying to ask the oppressor or engage with the oppressor and say, please, can you nicely, please, can you give us reparations? Or do you put more energy into nation building, Garvey process of erecting our institutions, our commonality, as you're touching on the more long term? And just lastly, to say, we do have a day where we have encouraged, as I put in the chat, for the last 8 years or so, which is the Reparations March on the 1st of Messiah. As we know, we've just come out of Messiah month, the month of August, every year in Brixton, with Sister Esther, Sister Jendai. We come out and we exercise our protest by March, and we didn't get to this year. So we encourage people to take that day off anyway. So it is about, in the final, connecting the dots so that people are aware and that we don't go on. Yes, we can reinvent the wheel if it's more efficient towards our cause, which is liberation from our oppressor. But yeah, my real question is about energy. Where does one put most of their energy?
Okay, thank you, brother Nat. I think that's been well put. We've got that question. The next one up, Steve, you said you put up 3. Next question.
I think Paul Phoenix was the next in line.
Yes, I was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
Hello.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
All right. Professor Gus, thank you very, very much, as usual, for a very hard-hitting, truthful, no holds barred, and honest appraisal of what we're going through. We've met a few times, and I've always regarded it as an honor to speak to you. We have had a lot of opportunities. I remember some time ago, I was invited amongst other people to the DFES who were having a problem in decolonizing the curriculum. I'm talking about a good few years back. You're right. And we all went there and we spent most of the time arguing amongst ourselves. It was very, very embarrassing. And obviously, these guys just laughed because there we were talking about how to decolonize the curriculum, and all we did was spend a whole lot of time arguing about nothing. So that initiative actually just petered out. Now, I ran a project called Black Parents in Education, BLPIE. And the reason behind this, as well as Parents Against Racism in School, is to get the curriculum to reflect the contributions of our people, right? And I don't sort of go in for labels, so I just use the term Black people, and it encompasses a whole lot and everything, and we all know what I'm talking about. So Parents Against Racism in Schools has been responsible for tutoring a lot of Black pupils, standing with parents when they were hassled by the education system, who call in the social services, who call in the police, and all to do with hassling Black parents who decided to take their children away from the racist educational system. Now, I don't know if anyone here remembers a document that was written. It was called the UK Report on the Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. Now that came a very, very, very long time ago.
Yeah, Paul, because of time, and we want to try and get a few more questions in before we finish, can you put a question to Professor Gus?
Well, this is part of the question.
Yeah, can you make it succinct?
On the Article 12, it says, the parties shall, where appropriate, take measures in the fields of education and research to foster knowledge of the culture, history, language, and religion of their national minorities and the majority. Decolonizing national curriculum is nothing new. It happened years and years and years ago. It's in this document, right? And this came out in the 60s. The question is, Professor Gus, as we approach the next century or whatever have you, we are still in the same boat. How are we going to wake up and ask our own people, forget about this host community, our own people to stand up and put their effort where their mouth is? Because all we see at the moment is just talk, talk, talk. When are we going to see those people who walk the corridors of power, the Black people who walk the corridors of power, who's been given authority, who's been given a voice, use that authority and that voice to support the Black parents at the grassroots who are getting the blunt of the aggression of the educational system and other systems as well? Finally,
Thank you,
no,
Paul.
I'm a student. I'm a student
got the
of
question.
Thank
sociology.
you, Paul. We've had a big question there.
I've got the
And
question.
Gus, if you get on with those three, we've also know the
Okay,
clock.
okay.
Yes, thanks.
We don't have a lot of time. Let me, in my answers, I'll try and deal with all the issues that have been raised without responding to each individual. The first point I want to make really is this, that we are all differently situated. Some of us are members of organized groupings, whether they be radical parties or organizations or tendencies or whatever else it may be. Others of us are not. There are many people who are experiencing stuff such as I have been describing in the presentation, day by day, and don't know where to turn. They have some ideas as to how they might react, but they find the whole system is so pitted against them and so overbearing that they don't know where to go for guidance, or indeed what the formal procedures are that they might follow. Some of you will know that I chair this organization called the Communities Empowerment Network. I founded it with others in 1999. And since then, we've been doing work almost exclusively on school exclusions. The main group of people we're dealing with have been Black boys. And there are many parents who experience all kinds of horrors day to day at the hands of head teachers in schools who simply do not know where to turn. Now, we are in a very peculiar position. There are many groups of young people who, in relation to what they themselves are experiencing, are coming together and have come together and doing a range of really exciting and dynamic things. Some of it has some reference to what those of us who built the Black education movement since the middle 1960s have been about, others not. Many of them don't even know about what we did in relation to busing and banding and ESN and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that their attempts to deal with their immediate realities are very valid. They need support, and what they do not need is the conservatism and what's the word? The indifference of those who believe that, you know, they wanting to rock the boat and so on, and that you know, they should give the people a chance. Now, we've been giving the people a chance for God knows how long, and they've basically been kicking us into the ditch. So we have to acknowledge that there would be different formations and different responses across our population as a diaspora. Some of us are radical, some of us are revolutionary, some of us are backward and decidedly reactionary. Now, that is us in our diversity. So the issue then is, how do we ensure that we provide some support, encouragement, resources, not necessarily financial resources, to those young people who, on the basis of their experience and looking at the society through the prism of that experience, are attempting to do things with their own creative spirit and abilities that we used, me and others, in our time in the 1960s and 1970s, etc. But that they can draw upon the sort of things that we did, the lessons we've derived from that, so that they're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Above all, they do not get the idea that history began with them when they were born in some maternity hospital somewhere. And that, you know, there are footprints. We leave footprints. There are people before me who have left footprints long before this 1948 Empire Windrush nonsense. And we need to understand that. We need to deal with one another with sensitivity, with love, with compassion, so that we're able to provide space for people to make the mistakes, to take risks, to be bold, to be assertive, to be uncompromising. And it is when we get to that position collectively that we begin to see the opportunity for growth, the opportunity for reconciliation, the opportunity to unite and make demands for reparatory justice, for restitution, for more of a say in the way that our lives are organized.
Thanks very much for that, Gus. Steve, are there any more questions?
That's all.
That's all for now.
Yeah.
Okay, we should pause there for a moment, because I think.
Hang on. Frank Murray's just put his hand up.
Okay, there, Frank. Come on in.
I'm sorry to extend your thing a bit. Professor, what I mean, you gave us a list of our Black MPs, our police. We've got the, you mentioned the Stephen Lawrence, and we've even got our own princess now. All these to me are like symbolic changes. Even the Windrush, we're finishing that by paying off the Windrush people who are affected by it. But to me, again, all this is like symbolic changes. And whenever we something happens, we get together and we fight and we get this symbolic changes at the end. And how do we go about getting the structure? Because it's the structure that keeps bringing these things up, and we are not changing the structure. How do we go about knocking the structure down?
Okay, let me try. Let me try and be quick about this. I think first of all we need to understand one thing, and that is that parliamentary democracy as far as we as African diaspora people are concerned, places us in a handcart to hell. All right. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is this. Operation Black Vote spent God knows how long not only trying to get Black people to vote, but really saying it doesn't matter who you vote for, but vote. So even if you end up having James Cleverly and God knows that wretched Priti Patel and Kwarteng and all of those people in the Conservative Party, or their equivalents in the Labour Party, then it really doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is you've used your franchise, you've made your voices heard. Now, I'm not against parliamentary democracy, right? I do not want to live under the Taliban. Yeah. I do not want to live in Belarus. Right. But having said that, we have to understand our own positioning as African diaspora people. We have to understand what the parliament that we and the democracy that we are now a part of did to us and our ancestors. We have to understand what the racialization of immigration means and why it was in their interest to racialize immigration and to hoodwink the white working class in this society to believe that we, our presence as Black people, was antithetical to their own interests. We have to understand that. And when we understand that, then we can determine that, yes, we might vote, but that takes second place. It's subordinate to the need for us to organize ourselves independently, politically, so that we can use our power, make our voices heard, and make demands on those whom we put our X against and put into parliament. At the moment, it is lopsided. We keep electing all of these wretched people. And all they do is they dump upon us from a great height. You know, I mean, in a piece I wrote recently, I used the Latin I'm saying, you know, semper in fecibus sumus, solum profundum variat. We are always in the SHIT. All that matters is the depth. Now we have the capacity to do something about that. And we don't do something about it simply by following bloody Starmer, whatever his first name is, Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, or for that matter, Priti Patel and Boris Johnson and those hopeless people. So how do we begin to organize ourselves independently while at the same time acknowledging that we are operating within this parliamentary democratic system? That is what is lacking. And worse yet, we subject ourselves to this nonsense about neoliberalism and individualism. So we find private solutions to the ills that affect us all. We take care of ourselves, we take care of our children's education, we take care of this and that, and the devil take the hindmost. Recipe for disaster. So if I don't want my grandchildren to have to be fighting the same battles that I have been fighting for since 1964, then it is incumbent upon me to use every breath that I have, every step that I take, to build a different structure within our communities, that we might organize ourselves independently and understand that our interests are not their interests, and our demands would never be particularly accommodated by them.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think we should thank our speakers at this point. Professor Gus, thank you once more for such a exciting meeting. And I hear the questions that have been coming from the floors about people wanting to do things, wanting to be active, wanting to try and sort some of these problems you flagged up, and so many of them. We want to encourage people, if you're at all interested in the work that CLS is doing, please visit our website, join us. We're an organization that is not funded. We raise our money through membership and through donations, and we encourage you to join us. We don't, we generally support the Labour Party and trade unionism, but we are an independent organization working with our own agenda, fighting for the things we believe in. And we certainly see that our lot in this country is tied with what is happening, not only here, but in the Caribbean, in the Americas. And for me, the most hopeful part of politics and of change happening is in our region. And we need to bring some of that knowledge, expertise, and activism from our region to bear on Britain in the areas that we can affect and bring about some change. So we want to encourage you to join us. But before I close the meeting, I hope you'll hang around for a minute, Gus, and the other speaker, Francisco, so we can do a proper thank you at the end. We've also got an executive committee, which we meet on a regular basis, and they take on different responsibilities for different areas of activities that we do. And so I want to give them an opportunity now to just update, inform, and announce any meetings that might be coming up. Steve, you want to come in there?
Okay, just one thing. CLS is working with the Socialist History Society, the Institute for the Institute for Commonwealth Studies, and the Society for Caribbean Studies, to have a series of events in the new year looking at the history of socialism in the Caribbean. We want to. There's a really rich history of workers' organisation, of socialist organisation, of workers' struggles in the Caribbean that we think needs to be drawn upon, remembered, and so on. So I've circulated to the mailing list a week or so, last week. This, if anyone wants to make a contribution to this, anyone who's done any research, anyone who's got any knowledge of the history of socialism in the Caribbean, it'll be more than welcome to take part. And we will then advertise the events, which will be evening meetings on Zoom. Hopefully there'll be people from the Caribbean speaking, as well as people from Europe. So that's something that we're working on between now and the new year.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Steve. And I should also remind people that we produce a journal, Cutlass, which comes out roughly about every 2 months. And we're really willing to have people writing articles such. We will put, your article, if there's something you want to comment on, if there's anything you want to write, please visit our website and see what we're about and make that contact. We'll be happy to put something out there. Okay, there's some other announcements.
Yeah. Yes, the Global African Congress will today, they have every Sunday they have an international solidarity meeting. They've got a meeting today beginning at 4 o'clock, a Zoom meeting. It will be about the Africans living in the south of the Americas. I'll find the joining instructions. Ooh. Yes, the joining instructions will be 906-317-7486, and the passcode will be SIS001. Anybody, we're all welcome there, and yeah, that's for this. Thank you.
Put the joining instructions, please.
Okay, it is again 906-317-7486, and the password is SIS uppercase 001.
Great. Thank you for that, Frank. Maybe you can put it in the chat as well, if people can pick it up in the next few moments.
Okay, will do.
Denot, can we hear from Denot?
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Working with other comrades in CLS, including Steve, we have established, as part of the CLS portfolio, if you like, a website entitled Decolonizing Education. And I'm just putting the details onto the chat. And its purpose is to bring together all of the organizations, including those who've attended here today, to a common place where we can aid and assist each other by providing information on the history of good old British Empire and on what's happening currently. And the purpose is not that we're going to lead anything, because we don't have the capacity, but in this way we can help each other understand what's happening. And one of the main contributors to this website is Danny, who is here with us under the name of Mayflower Mavericks. He has created a timeline of Britain's history and its colonial exploits going back several hundred years. And
I've updated it in the software, so you put your ID in, it doesn't connect. What ID is that?
And each incident contains just a brief description of what's happened. we're asking contributors to fill out these incidents and bring incidents of their own. And so hopefully we can start to change how Britain thinks of itself. Thank you.
Good, thanks, Dana. Okay, I think Omar, you would have put other things in the chat. Is there anything else we need to draw attention to now before we start to finally wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Professor Gus John and Francisco Dominguez for delivering some very poignant and extremely important points today. We still have more to do, but obviously we stand in solidarity with all colleagues, and thank you for everyone joining us today. I've put in quite a few links in the chat to various things that are going on throughout the Caribbean world and that are related to the diaspora. There's one final thing that I'd like to bring to everybody's attention. So there is a parliamentary petition to basically make better provisions available for Black women of African and Caribbean descent who are affected by domestic violence. This is being called Valerie's Law, after Valerie Ford, who was brutally murdered by her ex-partner alongside her 23-month-old daughter. So I'm going to put the link in just here to be able to sign that petition. It's being run by an organization called Sister Space, who've recently opened up a shop in East London. They're a charitable organization. They are accepting donations, and essentially they've been at the helm of pushing to get Valerie's Law basically put into motion. It's only at 17,000 signatures at the moment. So essentially we do need to do as much as we can to get that past the 100,000 mark. I've put the link just in the chat there.
Great, thank you for that, Omar. I think it's really important we support that organization because we know racism plays a crucial part in terms of domestic violence, and funding for Black women's organizations have been slow in coming forward, if at all. And Black women are disproportionately affected by domestic violence in many ways. And also there are many dangers for Black women in the whole system, because we know in the way in which the police react and deal with these incidents of domestic violence in the Black community, either ignoring the women's seriousness of it or overreacting towards the men, some of them who could end up dead or seriously injured. Okay. Right, so we shall wrap up now. Thank you all so much for coming to the meeting. This wouldn't be happening without you, and especially for those that put questions to our speakers. I'd like us to remember the words of Dr. Francisco Dominguez at the beginning about the positive things that are happening in Latin America, and may the pink tide get even redder in the next elections coming up. So we look forward to hearing your report, I think, which will probably be in November then. So, but thank you again, Dr. Francisco Dominguez. And also thank you to Gus for such a enlightened and inspiring meeting with so many questions that has carried this meeting so well. And thank you all for coming. And look forward to seeing you at the next meeting. Thank you. All right. Maybe